Okay, go back to, in the early part of the book, you say you wanted to write an unbiased view of the 67 war. After hearing your background, is that possible to do that?
Not easy. Not easy. Today, in history, it's very fashionable, in postmodernist, relativist history, to say, you can't write objective history. Don't even bother trying, so write subjective history. And I adhere to that very quaint 19th century notion that there is an historical truth out there. And that we, as historians, though we can never really reach that truth completely, we have an obligation to strive toward it. And therefore, if we have prejudices, and of course we all have them, if we have biases, that we have to regard them not as opinions to be indulged, but as obstacles to be overcome. Because if we want to understand this war, and this is a war that, as I said before, so profoundly impacts our lives in Israel, in the Middle East, and even in the United States, if we're going to understand it, then indulging my opinions are not going to help us very much. And on a sort of daily methodological level, in writing every page, every paragraph, and sometimes even every sentence, I'd have to stop and ask myself, okay, am I letting my prejudices, ideas, opinions impinge on what I'm writing here? How might I write this if I was completely objective? And very often I change the text. Very often I change the text. The best compliments I've had from this book, Brian, have come from Arab scholars. And the reaction from the Arab world has been overwhelmingly positive. In fact, I've really had no negative reactions. That have been written about in the Egyptian press. I've been asked to interview on Al Jazeera. I've given lectures at universities where Arab scholars were present, at Oxford and at Harvard recently. It's been giving me a tremendous amount of satisfaction, that reaction.
By the time you got to the 67 war, how many wars had Israel fought in?
So he said the 67 war was Israel's third war. Sometimes it's referred to as the third Arab-Israeli war. 1948, which was Israel's War of Independence. The 1956 war, which was the Israelis called the Sinai Campaign. The Arabs called the tripartite aggression. It's one of the things about total war. We even have different names for our war. The Arabs called the 1948 war the Nakba, the disaster. Right? But this was not a disaster for the Israelis. It was Israel's War of Independence. The 67 war is called by the Israelis the Six-Day War. It's referred to in the United States as the Six-Day War. But the Arabs take great umbrage at that term. It simply means, oh, the Israelis beat you in 6 days. I actually used it once accidentally in an interview with a former Jordanian general. He almost entered the interview right then. He was so insulted. They refer to it as the setback. They have a number of euphemisms for the war, but mostly they refer to it as the June War, sort of an anodyne term.
After the 67 war, of course, we'll go back to it, but how many wars have there been since 67?
Well, it depends on its count. We even count the wars differently. The Israelis identify a war of attrition, which broke out along the Suez Canal shortly after the end of the Six-Day War and continued to August 1970 in a United States brokered ceasefire. And then there was the 1973 war. The Arabs refer to this, the Egyptians in particular, refer to the 67 war, the War of Attrition, and the 73 war as one long war. Right? The 73 war is known in Israel as the Yom Kippur War. In Egypt and the Arab world, it's either referred to as the October War or the Ramadan War. June 1982, the Lebanon War, which in one way or another continued until May of 2000. And the Gulf War, which wasn't exactly an Arab-Israeli war, but it had certainly an Arab-Israeli component to it, as I mentioned earlier. And now we've had the outbreak of two intifadas, if you can say those words in the plural. The first from 1987 to 1992, and the last from September 2000 to the present.
By the way, how many Americans are living in Israel and have dual citizenship?
You know, I don't know. It's probably around 70 to 80,000.
Go back to 48 for a moment. When did the UN declare Israel to be a country?
The decision of the UN came on the 29th of November 1947, when the UN General Assembly voted to create a Jewish and an Arab state in Palestine, to partition Palestine into two states. All right. Upon this declaration, the Palestinians declared war on the Jewish half. That effort was frustrated ultimately by Jewish defense, and when the partition resolution came into being on May 14th, 1948, 7 Arab armies invaded the new Jewish state, the nascent Jewish state, in an effort to prevent its emergence, and that effort was also rebuffed.
What was the size of the Jewish state after the vote in the UN and they partitioned it off?
I'll rephrase the answer a little bit. The Jewish state that emerged as the State of Israel at the end of the War of Independence, at the beginning of 1949, was 30% larger than the Jewish state created by the UN in November of 1947. The Israeli forces had succeeded in pushing the Arabs back. Now, the Israelis had conquered no sovereign Arab territory, but that 30% would have been part of the Palestinian Arab state had that state, in fact, come into being. As it happened, the area that had been earmarked for the Palestinian state was taken up by Israel, by Jordan, which annexed the West Bank. The West Bank was supposed to have been part of that Palestinian state, and by Egypt, which occupied Gaza Strip.
So Israel didn't have Gaza, didn't have the West Bank.
Did not.
What part of Jerusalem did they not have?
They did not have the eastern part of Jerusalem.
What about the old city?
The old city was part of the East Jerusalem.
And that didn't belong, belonged to Jordan?
That belonged to Jordan. Jordan annexed it, by American terms, annexed it illegally. The annexation of the West Bank and Jerusalem was recognized only by 2 states in the world, by Britain and Pakistan.
Now, how long did that Israeli state stay together until it was, in 56, what was that war all about?
The 56 war was about, on the Israeli side, the fear that Nasser had become a proxy of the Soviet Union, had acquired mass amounts of Soviet arms.
He was the head of Egypt.
He was the head of Egypt, and he had been sending Palestinian guerrillas, Fedayeen as they were called then, to attack deep within Israel. And it was only a matter of time before Nasser used this massive Soviet weaponry in an offensive war of destruction. And Israel sought to launch a preemptive strike. It found an opportunity in the Suez Crisis. You recall that Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in July 1956. Britain and France, as the principal shareholders in the Suez Canal Company, tried to negotiate through American mediation a solution to the Suez Crisis. When no solution could be found, Britain and France elected to retake the canal by force of arms, and enlisted Israel's help in that effort. So Israel saw an alliance of convenience between Britain and France and herself, and launched this war.
I want to just show on this map here, where the lines, the diagonal lines, one at the bottom is the Sinai, and then over here is the Gulf of Suez. Just for the audience to look around and see where Jordan is located. Mm-hmm. Jordan used to control that area right there in the middle of Israel, which is the West Bank, and then you have Syria up at the top in Lebanon. 56 war lasted how long?
Well, for the British and the French, it lasted about 3 days. The Israelis, it continued a little bit longer, about 3-4 days, because Israel started. The Anglo-French invasion of the Suez Canal really occurred on the 3rd or 4th of November 1956, and Israel had launched its attack already on the 29th of October.
Who was in charge then? Who led the country in 56?
David Ben-Gurion was the prime minister, and the chief of the Israeli army, chief of staff, was Moshe Dayan.
And where were people like Ariel Sharon? Were they involved that early?
Sure. Ariel Sharon was involved in a very controversial action. Ooh, this gets complicated, Brian. As part of the deal with Britain, France, and Israel was to create a forward feint at the Suez Canal by dropping paratroopers in and around the Mitla Pass. Mitla Pass is the great pass that leads from Sinai, the interior of Sinai, to the canal zone. Britain and France would then issue an ultimatum to both Israel and Egypt, saying that in order to protect the canal, Israel and Egypt were to remove their forces from the proximity of the canal within 24 hours. It was assumed by the planners of this rather arcane operation that Egypt would reject the ultimatum, and that Britain and France would then use that as a pretext for reoccupying the canal in order to protect it. Follow that? And welcome to the Middle East. the Israeli commander of the paratroopers, the founder of the paratroopers, who parachuted into the Mitla Pass, was none other than Ariel Sharon. And to this day, there is a controversy over whether Sharon moved his troops, exceeded his orders by moving them into the Mitla Pass and engaging a far superior Egyptian force, and in the process incurred a great number of casualties. The greatest number of casualties in the entire war were from the Mitla Pass operation. And to this day, it's a point of controversy.
How old would he have been then?
He was a young man. He was in his early 30s.
Some of the other personalities involved, Itzhak Rabin, where was he in 56, leading up to the 67 war?
Itzhak Rabin was a commander in the northern of Israel. He wasn't involved in the war.
Where was Moshe Dayan?
Moshe Dayan was the chief of staff.
Where was Golda Meir?
Golda Meir was a Labor Party functionary. I believe at that time she was the foreign minister.
Where was Levi Eshkol? And who was
Levi Eshkol was the finance minister.
In 56?
In 56. Mm-hmm.
Who are some of the other leaders?
Who were around at that time?
Yeah.
Abba Eban. Abba Eban was had a dual capacity as Israel's ambassador both to the UN and to the United States.
Was his name really Aubrey Solomon?
It was. Still is.
He's still alive.
He is.
He was born Aubrey Solomon. This is Abba Eban in Cape Town, South Africa.
Right. His wife still calls him Aubrey.
When did he change his name?
He changed his name when he moved to Israel, as so many people do. Most of the people like Moshe Dayan, David Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, these weren't their original names. Right. The notion was to Hebraicize one's name to make immediate connection between the Israeli Zionist present and the ancient biblical past.
What was Golda Meir's name, do you remember?
Golda Meirson. David Ben-Gurion was David Green.
And he was from where originally?
From Ukraine, from Eastern Europe.
Where was Itzhak Rabin from? Was he a
Itzhak Rabin was Sabra, was a native-born Israeli. He was the first native-born Israeli.
Ariel Sharon, where was he from?
Ariel Sharon is from Russia originally. He still speaks Russian.
And Moshe Dayan?
No, you know that Ariel Sharon speaks Russian. Not great Russian, but passable Russian.
And Moshe Dayan was from where?
Moshe Dayan was born in Halal, in a moshav.
What about Shimon Peres?
Shimon Peres from Poland. Still has a Polish accent on his Hebrew, but that is often the butt of humor in Israel.
And what was his original name?
Pushki. It's good thing I remember these things. This is good Israeli.
Yeah, you're doing good here. Okay, we're leading up to 1967.
Right.
By the way, did Israel win 56?
Israel won the 56 militarily. There is a pattern always in Israeli military diplomatic history that Israel wins wars militarily, but cannot necessarily win them diplomatically, politically. Right. Certainly this was the case in 1948. 1948, Israel won an overwhelming victory over the Arabs, and yet it didn't secure the one thing that most victorious countries achieve in war. It didn't achieve peace. It didn't end the state of war. 1956, Israel decimated the Egyptian army, decimated the Egyptian Air Force, and yet did not achieve peace again. 67, one of the great military victories in all history. In terms of the amount of material lost by the Arabs, the men lost, the territory sacrificed by the Arab forces, it was just an overwhelming victory. Did Israel achieve peace in 1967? No.
So, actually, as you read your book, you get to day one. I mean, you break it up eventually, and day one takes right off from the first paragraph. I mean, it was interesting. Up until then, it's a history.
Right.
And then, boom, you're in the middle of a war. I mean, and you say by 7:30, close to 200 planes were aloft.
Right.
So June 5th, 1967, how big is the Israeli military?
So the military, about 100,000, 125,000 men, 200 aircraft.
And what kind of aircraft were they?
Mostly French aircraft.
No American aircraft?
No substantial. Mostly Mystiers and Mirages.
And what about the
Fuga jets?
Did they? I thought I saw a reference to Patton tanks.
There were a small number of Patton tanks. It was the first American-Israeli arms deal. They sold Patton M48 tanks, but Israel had a limited number of them. The largest M48 tank force in the Middle East was the Jordanian army, which was almost completely built around the M48. They had about 240 of them.
Who started?
That was the most advanced tank at the time.